This is Andy Purewal for Boxing News. I'm joined by Dan Rafael over Zoom. Dan, good to see you. Good to speak to you. It's been a while. How are things treating you? How's life?
Andy, everything is good. Thank you for having me on today.
I'm glad to hear it. Let's just get straight into it. I know you're a busy man. We had Oscar De La Hoya tweet earlier about Haney-Garcia will, in fact, be landing in New York. Obviously, we know Vegas was being touted for that fight. What's your understanding as to why they've decided to take it to the Brooklyn Center?
Well, first of all, I'm actually very excited that they're bringing this fight to Brooklyn because it's been quite a while, and Barclays Center is such a great arena. They've had probably in their existence probably around 50 events. I've covered most of them. First class facility, and New York City is dying for a big fight, a really big fight. Barclays Center hasn't had a boxing event of any kind since October 2022 when Deontay Wilder headlined and knocked out Robert Helenius in the first round on a PBC pay-per-view card. So there hasn't been a single fight of any kind in that building in all of 2023. And now, of course, here we are. It won't be till April of 2024. And also New York City, also the other big arena, the most famous arena, Madison Square Garden, has had a lot of boxing activity in the smaller theater at Madison Square Garden. But in terms of the main arena, the big boy arena, they haven't had a boxing event, I want to say, since December of 2022 when Teofimo Lopez had the fight against Sandor Martin. So it's been a long time since there's been a boxing event in the main arena at that facility or at Barclays Center. So to bring a big fight and a legit big fight back to New York is a great thing. I mean, in the United States anyway, you can't have every big fight in Vegas. The East Coast has not had a major fight in a while. And I mean, maybe I'm slightly biased because I live on the East Coast, but I've covered fights all over the United States. And there's always been at least, a decent amount of fights taking place in New York and other places on the East Coast. And lately, it's been everything, either Vegas, Texas. I mean, basically, those are the only two places. Some obviously in California. But, if you want to have a worldwide sport and a national sport anyway in America, you got to spread it around. And I know Ryan Garcia and Devin Haney are more West Coast fighters, but their style and their popularity will extend to the East Coast. And I can tell you, I'm almost positive that fight will do a very big number at the gate and in terms of ticket sales. And, that's perfectly capable of hosting, a mega fight. They've had plenty of huge fights in New York. Barclays Center's hosted tons of big fights. So from that point of view, I'm actually really happy. Now, it wasn't by design, as you mentioned, Andy. His fight was meant for Las Vegas. Oscar De La Hoya said it plenty of times. He came on my podcast, Super Bowl Sunday. We taped an interview. And he said in that, this is right after the fight was made and they hadn't announced the venue yet. He said it's going to be in Las Vegas. The problem with Las Vegas for this particular date is April 20th is in very close proximity on the calendar to May 4th, which is the date that PBC has blocked out for Canelo Alvarez. And if anybody knows anything about venue deals and how they work, the promoter and the host usually have a blackout period before their big event because they don't want somebody taking an event, a venue, a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever. Usually it's about 3 weeks, I think, ahead of their event, which will cannibalize their potential ticket sales. So the PBC people, from my understanding, did not want to allow that fight to be in either the MGM Grand or the T-Mobile Arena, which are the two main arenas that the MGM folks control. Mandalay Bay also, but that's a much smaller arena, so it probably wouldn't be large enough to host this fight. That's only about 10, 12,000 packed in. T-Mobile is 20, MGM is 18, so they got blocked out by the PBC having that date, even though they don't actually have an official Canelo fight to tell the public that they're hosting. There's no tickets on sale. The bottom line, though, is once they couldn't go in either of those two arenas in Las Vegas. And I don't know if there was available. I don't think there was an appetite to go in the other major arena, which is the Thomas and Mack Center, kind of antiquated, not really affiliated with the MGM, that they just said, you know what, we got to find another place. And they couldn't have done a better job than to go to Barclays Center.
We will obviously come on to Canelo and what's going on with him in a short while, but just sticking with the theme of Haney-Garcia, going into this fight, pretty much anybody I speak to quite heavily favours Devin Haney, and I would imagine it's quite understandable why people would do so because of their styles and where they're both at with their careers at this moment in time. What do you make of this fight, though, when it swings around, when April 20th is upon us?
I understand why Haney is the favorite. He should be the favorite. I think even Ryan Garcia is no dummy. He's a knowledgeable person about the perspective on him and his career. He understands there's a reason why Devin would be the favorite. I believe Devin's the champion. Devin looked fantastic in his last fight. He shut out Regis Prograis, who was a long time top guy in the weight class and had been a champion twice. And now the only loss he had before that was a fight that probably could have gone either way against Taylor. So he's looked good, and he looked good in his other fights at lightweight. He defeated easily Kambosos. Yes, it was a close fight against Lomachenko. He got the win. That was sort of a mixed bag in terms of the opinions of people. But the point is, he's a brilliant boxer, and Ryan Garcia, although he looked pretty good against Oscar Duarte and getting the knockout in his most recent fight, Oscar Duarte is a good fighter, but not an elite fighter in that weight class. And prior to that, of course, we all know what happened against Gervonta Tank Davis. So, it's kind of like, boxing, Andy. It's kind of like, what have you done for me lately? So people view it as Haney is the master boxer, maybe not with the best power, but he can definitely out-hustle you, out-punch you, and has great defense and good slick movement. But Ryan Garcia, yes, understandably the underdog, but if you're making the case for him, I think he matches Haney for hand speed and speed in general. He has much better power, I think, than Devin Haney. He's got an electrifying left hook if he can land it. And, we'll have to see what happens. But I suspect this is a big time fight. And don't forget also, it's not your normal kind of big fight. Now, I don't usually make a lot when it comes to like what their backgrounds are as amateur boxers. Yes, I mean, it plays into storylines, and they certainly have a familiarity if they've boxed before in the amateurs. These guys have more. I mean, I've been doing this for a long time, and I don't ever remember a big fight that I was getting ready to write about or cover where the two combatants had this much amateur history. You know what I mean? Like, okay, I'll give you an example. I covered Shane Mosley, Vernon Forrest years ago. There was a huge storyline that Vernon had beaten Shane in the amateurs in an upset and kept Shane Mosley off the 1992 United States Olympic team. That's like a big deal going to that fight. And then he beat him again in the pros to win the welterweight title. And then he beat him again in the rematch. So it's sort of like that was a huge storyline. And there's other examples of guys in the amateurs who then go and meet in big time pro fights. Devin Haney and Ryan Garcia have boxed 6 times as amateurs. That's a lot compared to your normal major fight that materializes in the pro ranks. And they're 3-3 against each other, which is why they're calling this fight. I don't know if it's official, but they've been saying like this one counts. In other words, this is the real deal for the major world championship and obviously, top dog status in that weight class. So there's a lot of history between these guys. They know each other well in that respect. And I suspect that that's going to bring a lot to the promotion. And I think Haney understands and Ryan understands, like, it's one thing for Ryan to lose to Tank Davis in his first really big fight. You lose a second big time fight, you're going to get labeled a loser and the B side and just a guy that's good enough to be in the fight, but they can't get over the hump. At some point, you got to win the big fight. Haney, he's won big fights before. It's important for him to maintain the title and all that, but I think Ryan's going to feel like, my back's a little bit against the wall in this one. And I'm just looking forward to a great promotion. They got their news, set of news conferences they're doing next week in New York City and Los Angeles, and then on to the fight. And I am pumped for this one.
Just want to stick with the 140 division, Dan, because this week we've had a press tour in the UK of Josh Taylor and Taylor-Catterall, which it's certainly been heated to say the least between the pair of them. What have you made of watching it from afar, and what do you make of their rematch taking place a couple of years on from their first bout?
Well, as far as it happening, I mean, it's about time. I mean, I know they made the fight in the past and there was different reasons why it didn't happen. It's not a situation where one guy was ducking the other. I mean, they can say what they want, but neither guy was ducking. You know the deal. There was issues in terms of logistics, I believe, with Sky at one point. Taylor was, had an injury. He had a mandatory call. Before that, there was the issues, if you will, with the Catterall's promotional situation. So different things happen. And then when Josh had the foot injury, the WBO sort of got tired of waiting around for this fight to consistently be rescheduled. And they were like, screw it. And they ordered the mandatory against Teofimo Lopez. And we know what happened. He ended up losing the title. So they're both in a position, it seems to me, where this is the only big fight that there is for either one of these guys, because Catterall feels completely robbed of what happened in the first fight. And then you take it and look at what he's done since then. 2 fights against not exactly top level opponents. He won, but I don't know if anybody would say Jack looked great in those fights. You know, the Foley fight was, you know, he won, fair enough, but he's fighting like a C-level guy. The Linares fight was a complete mismatch. And yeah, he won, but I don't think he looked good in that fight, really, against a, you know, an ancient fighter. You know, Jorge Linares always been a stalwart veteran, a guy that gave a great effort, but, you know, shouldn't have even been in that fight. And you look at what Josh has done since their fight. He got wiped out by Teofimo Lopez. So where are these guys going? This is the fight that the British public wants. This is the fight that I think the two fighters want. And it makes a lot of sense. They can make a lot of money, and they can, you know, set the record straight. However you saw the first fight go. So I watched the press conference. I watched the Edinburgh press conference, the one that was in Scotland. I didn't really see other but a couple of the highlights of the second press conference from, I believe it was in Manchester. You know, it was entertaining. I mean, they know there's a lot of animosity between these guys. You know, it's a quote unquote big fight, but not for a world title, obviously, because of the fact that Josh lost the title to Lopez. I just hope it's a good fight, because here's the thing. I understand that there was a lot of heat at the press conference. You know, I think the name of the fight, you know, hate runs deep, is a little bit over the top. You know, both of these guys got up at that Scotland press conference and basically said, you know, they don't hate each other. They don't like each other, but they don't have hate in their heart or anything like that. I don't see these as being like bad guys or anything. So that's maybe a little over the top. I get the promotional end of it, though. But the thing that nobody wants to talk about, understandably, at least on the promotional side, is the first fight was not a good fight, man. It was not a good fight. It was a lot of grappling, a lot of holding, a lot of messiness, not a lot of clean punching. And the only reason this rematch is taking place is because of the controversy over the scoring, but not based on the merit of the actual combat. Usually you see a rematch, most of the time it's because they had a great fight and the fans clamor for a rematch and they want to see that action all over again. Not the case in Taylor versus Catterall. They want to see the rematch to set the record straight on the scoring of the first fight, not because it was a great fight. I hope that they live up to the words that they spoke at the press conference about really going after and make this a memorable fight. And, you know, hopefully they'll do that. I mean, they're proud pros who are near the top of the weight class. And it's a big fight for them, because Taylor, you know, to lose two in a row, you know how that goes, especially against a good opponent. And for Catterall, you know, he needs to get the win to make it so people will realize or think that what was scored in the first time around, you know, it was a mistake, and that he was the rightful winner.
Just in and amongst all of this talk of what's happening at super lightweight, where does Teofimo Lopez now fit into all of this, Dan?
Well, he's the champ. I mean, you know, he may have not looked great in the last fight against Jermaine Ortiz a couple of weeks ago, but he's the WBO champ. He's the lineal champ. He beat Taylor. You know, he looked great in the Taylor fight. Teofimo is just he's shown himself. The evidence is mounting that he has inconsistencies in his performances, that he will sometimes, or a lot of times, I guess, fight down to the level of the opposition. I mean, when you step him up and he's fighting, you know, for his first world title. I'm not saying Richard Comey was a great fighter, but he really came out that night and just destroyed him to make a statement to win that title. You know, he did the job and looked. I didn't think he looked great, but he certainly won the fight and looked strong enough in winning the fight against Lomachenko to unify the titles. That was a huge win. And then he's like a 1,000,000-to-1 favorite against George Kambosos. And, you know, it was a great fight, but he didn't really show what he's about in that fight. I know there was definitely issues in terms of, you know, injury and stuff in that fight in terms of his medical situation. But even still, when he came off of that loss and went up to 140 pounds, he had two fights. One against, was Pedro Campa. I mean, he won by a stoppage, but that was just a pedestrian kind of performance. And then the next fight against Sander Martin, I was at that fight. Everybody around me, you know, lots of us thought that he lost that fight. Or even if he won, it was way too close than it should have been. He got knocked down, and he, you know, he was so freaked out by that terrible performance and he was so emotional after the fight that Top Rank wouldn't let him come to the press conference. It wasn't that Lopez didn't want to come. They were like, you know what? Because they were afraid what he was going to say and do. You know, he threatened retirement. I don't have it anymore, blah, blah, blah. So he looked, you know, pretty bad in those two fights. Now he comes back, big underdog anyway. I don't know how big he was an underdog. And now he's fighting, you know, the undefeated champ, Josh Taylor. And a lot of people didn't think he had a chance to win that fight. And what did he do? He showed up that night, looked awesome, won easily. And so you have the back and forth. And then what happens? He comes back, and now he defends against Jermaine Ortiz, a good opponent, but not some pound-for-pound guy. Gave Lomachenko a solid fight, but still lost. And he doesn't show up in that fight either. Now, look, I thought that Jermaine Ortiz, as horrible as that fucking fight was, I thought that Jermaine Ortiz won the fight because he frustrated Lopez rounds 1 to 12. You know, he just gave him a clinic on boxing movement. Now, I'm not saying this is the end all be all. Punch stat wise, they were about the same in terms of the punches landed. I think Jermaine Ortiz actually got credited with landing like 2 more punches than Lopez, but that's basically even up. Just a bad performance, and you know, who knows? But he won the fight. He's the champ, and he's still a big name. And there's plenty of action in that weight class. Whether Tank comes up or the winner of Devin Haney against Ryan Garcia, you know, I'm not worried about Top Rank getting a significant fight for Teofimo Lopez. They know what they're doing, and Lopez still is a good name in this business.
Dan, just moving away from Teo, going back up to the name of Canelo Alvarez, you briefly mentioned him earlier, and that May 4th date. We're still waiting to see what's what. We've seen Jamal Charlo mentioned. We've seen Canelo recently dismiss the possibility of a fight with Terence Crawford. We've seen Jaime Munguia's name mentioned again today. What's your understanding of where things sit with that May 4th date and PBC trying to maybe announce more dates now going into the rest of this year?
I mean, it seems like it's up in the air. I mean, I wish I could tell you that. I mean, a lot of times I do have some inside knowledge on certain things for sure. This is one of those times where I just don't think they all are on the same page and know exactly what they are doing. And in terms of not agreeing on what the plan is, that maybe the PBC folks have one idea of the best form to go, the best course of action. Maybe Canelo and his team have a little bit of a different idea about it. Obviously, financial things come into play depending on who the opponent's going to be. So all the guys you're mentioning are names that are around there. And I saw the recent Instagram video that Charlo made. He was on a boat with his family and his kid and his wife and his mom, and he was drinking rum punches and saying he hadn't spoken to Al Heyman since his last fight, which was at the end of last year. So he didn't know what all this noise was about, how he's supposed to be the opponent for May 4th. I mean, you can believe him or not, but it didn't certainly seem like there was a deal in place or anything along those lines. There was definitely conversation between the parties about a possibility of a Munguia fight, but that was in the very early stages. And I know for a fact that Golden Boy is still ticked off because they got aced out of the Vegas venues for the Ryan Garcia Devin Haney fight. So I'm not sure what their appetite is to move forward and try to make a deal with him. And now they probably will do it because, and hold their nose because it's still a money-making opportunity for them and their fighter. It's still a great opportunity. And they're not the only ones that have a say-so. They've got a say-so. Obviously, Munguia has a say-so, and he also has a co-promoter in Fernando Beltran who has a say-so. But that's not an easy deal to make is what I'm trying to say. I mean, I wrote a column that was posted on my Fight Freaks Unite Substack newsletter that blasted out to all of my subscribers and is on the website. That the right fight is Canelo Benavidez. This ain't rocket science, but for whatever reason, Canelo has not really embraced that or shown a desire to move forward. I know 1,000% that from multiple conversations, at least what they say to me and publicly, if they're able to get offered that fight, they'll make a deal. I mean, Samson Lukowicz, who's the promoter for Benavidez, and David himself, that's the fight they want. They understand what the market is. They understand the going rate. They're not looking to carve out every single penny. They just desperately want to get that opportunity. They'll make a lot of money in that fight if they get offered the match. It's all about, is Canelo willing to do the fight? But at this moment in time, he hasn't really shown a desire to do that. Now, he's fought everybody through his career. I've always liked the fact that he's fought all the top guys. He's fought a lot of guys when his own team didn't want him to fight the fights against guys like Arislandi Lara and Austin Trout, and he was like, no, I'm doing the fight. And he's got a great resume. He's moved up in weight multiple times. He took on Bivol, who was a boogeyman. Anyway, I'm making the point, though, for whatever reason, he's not that interested in Benavidez at the moment, at least publicly. And everybody wants to go through these gymnastics about what's the right fight when it's sitting right in front of you. Because Benavidez is the mandatory. He's the interim title holder. He's got a growing fan base. He's been on pay-per-view and had modest success where Munguia has never been in that position. It's a great fight style-wise, right? They're both brawler, puncher, good boxers also, good power, great chins. I've said this 1,000 times, Andy. Canelo Alvarez is the undisputed super middleweight champ of the world. David Benavidez is the undisputed #1 contender. He is the people's mandatory. That's the fight that people want. And when you get the notion that they don't want to make that fight, and they go through all these other fighters trying to make excuses and reasons why that should be the fight, you're like, what the fuck are you talking about? David Benavidez is the right fight. Don't give me this Charlo nonsense. Yeah, Munguia is a fine fight, fine, but it's not bigger or better than a fight against David. Okay, I understand Crawford. I get that, and I'm not even anti the Crawford fight. I would have no problem seeing that fight, but I can't, in good conscience, say to me it's a more interesting fight than the Benavidez fight. And there's a huge financial element there also. To get Terence Crawford in the boxing ring to fight against Canelo Alvarez is going to take a certain amount of money, a lot more money than it's going to take to get David Benavidez in the ring. And so if you're doing all your, ROI analysis, Benavidez seems like the better bet. I mean, that's the thing that's so crazy about this. And they're running out of time, obviously. I mean, they still have time, but if you're going to do a big promotion, and by the way, a new platform in the United States with Amazon Prime Video, they've got the March 30th event coming up, but they have no history of pay-per-view events on that platform. You want to give yourself the best opportunity for success, and that means getting this fight done early so you can really get out there and promote the heck out of it.
Just mentioning Terence Crawford there, Dan, obviously it seems to be that the Spence Jr. rematch will not be taking place next. With that in mind, again, where do things sit with him? Is he looking at the potential winner of Tszyu versus Thurman?
That's a really good question. I mean, I know that Crawford would probably love to have the Canelo fight because it's a fight, even though the weight disparity is pretty great and he'd have to move up, quite a few pounds. I think he's really confident in his skills and his everything about him and the way he trains and just his defense, his power, the whole 9 yards. It's a tough fight, but that's the fight I think that he would really get up for. He's got so much accomplishment. It's also a gigantic payday if it could come to pass. So if he's not going to get the Canelo fight, that's a really good question. I mean, I think my interest, I would love to see him fight Tszyu if Tim looks good against Keith Thurman. I mean, it's pretty clear that the Errol Spence rematch is not happening, at least not next. There's no doubt about that. And there's been maybe I've heard some fan chatter, and I've thought about it, like, what about against Jermell Charlo, who just lost to Canelo, but that was at super middleweight. He's still the junior middleweight champion, even though some of his belts have been stripped away or vacated because of mandatories. That would be an appealing fight, even though Charlo's coming off such a poor performance against Canelo. But I still think there would be some heat for that promotion. So those seem like the best names that would make sense would be either against Tszyu, which would be really interesting, or against Charlo. And then, again, I'm not saying this is going to happen. It's a really complicated deal to make for a million different reasons. But it's not outrageous, the fact that you have Teofimo Lopez, the 140-pound champion, been calling out Terence Crawford, the 147-pound champion. Totally normal for the junior welterweight champ to fight the welterweight champ. It's happened a million times in boxing. And I don't think that's got a real chance of happening, particularly after Teofimo's most recent fight. But it's just food for thought that it's at least something that put in the back of your mind as a possible interesting matchup.
What are your thoughts on Tszyu versus Thurman, Dan?
I mean, it's an okay fight. I'm not anti that fight. I've seen a lot of negativity about it. I think the negativity is mainly based on the fact that it's a pay-per-view as opposed to a non-pay-per-view. But the matchup itself is perfectly fine to me. I respect what the WBO did, Paco Varkarsel and the WBO crew not sanctioning it for Tim's WBO 154-pound title, making the point, which is obvious, that Keith has had a very long layoff. Keith has never campaigned or fought any, early in his career, he fought a few fights in the 154-pound division. But in terms of his, as a contender and as a welterweight champ and all that, never fought in this weight class. He's not ranked by the WBO. So for them to make it a non-title fight and give the permission, I get that, 155-pound catch weight, contract weight for this matchup. And for Tim Tszyu, it's a great opportunity to take on a guy with a good name. Say what you want about Keith Thurman and the inactivity, but when Keith was at his best and fighting regular, he was the best, or one of the top couple of welterweights in the world. Has some big wins against guys like Sean Porter and Danny Garcia, and has scored some significant victories. Obviously, he lost the Pacquiao fight, no shame in that. But it's a good name, and it's a chance for Tszyu to continue to make a bigger name for himself in the United States, where he said he wanted to fight. So, again, I think the negativity about it is the unfortunate inactivity of Thurman and the fact that it's not for the title, but and the fact that it's a pay-per-view. But I personally am like, okay, I've always liked watching Keith fight. Why not? It's not like there's some other big name that he could take on in the division that was available. And the truth be told, if PBC had their way, they would have had Tank Davis headlining that March 30th kickoff card for pay-per-view with Amazon Prime. But for different reasons, that did not happen. So Tim Tszyu gets the spot, and they've made a nice card out of it.
Dan, I want to move bit more into the welterweight division now. It's not really a surprise to most that Tank Davies turned down the proposal of fighting Conor Benn. But with that in mind, Eddie's obviously spoken about a potential Danny Garcia Conor Benn fight. Do you know anything about that? Any talks? How they might be progressing at all in the background?
Well, the whole thing with what occurred with the prospect of a Conor Benn and Gervonta Davis fight, which I also wrote about in that column I referenced earlier, to me was absolutely a joke. And I don't blame Eddie Hearn for that because he's doing his job. He's a great promoter. You're getting your guy's name out there. You're stirring things up, and that's what he's supposed to do. So I'm sending the offer, and it's we hope he takes the fight, and we're going to make the fight. And well, he didn't take the offer. I mean, they're getting news and clicks all day long on that kind of stuff. But that fight never had a prayer of being made. It was a complete farce from the beginning. Why in the world? I'm not saying that they wouldn't take it. Conor Benn and Matchroom, I'm sure would have done the fight. Why wouldn't they? But the question is, when you're the A side like Tank Davis and you got other possibilities for fights like that where you can make as big a money and way more than Eddie was probably offering him, there's zero reason. Conor Benn is a non-entity commercially in the United States, as popular as or well-known or notorious, however you want to describe it, in the UK. But here in America, he means nothing. He's not a pay-per-view attraction. His last two fights have taken place in the United States in venues where if you combine the capacity of seating was probably less than 3,000 seats. So he doesn't mean anything here. Again, I'm not knocking, the UK popularity, but Tank Davis against him as a pay-per-view in America, he might as well be in fighting you or me because, it just it won't make a difference here in the States. Plus, why would he do that? He's a guy with a lightweight title who's fought one time in the junior welterweight division. And now they're asking him to fight a guy that's a welterweight that's really a junior middleweight. It never made sense on any possible level. So you ask about the other matchup that's been mentioned about Danny Garcia. That's actually a pretty good fight. I would like to see that. Why not, right? It'd be by far the best and biggest name that Conor Benn ever faced. And Danny Garcia, yes, he's at the twilight of his career, but he's had a heck of a career. He's probably like a borderline Hall of Fame type candidate. And we've seen him, but it's just not been often enough. I could see that fight possibly being made. PBC right now, they don't have any events until the end of March, and I think that they have shown that if their right opportunity comes for their guys, they're not opposed to making the deal. And under the right circumstances, why not make that fight? I think that's a really interesting fight. There'd be good heat between them. Good storylines lead into that fight. A lot of it's going to depend on if Conor gets the license back in the UK. Again, if he can't get licensed in the UK, to do Danny Garcia against Conor in the United States, that's a little bit rough because it's just not the kind of fight that's going to sell a ton of tickets. You can't put that on pay-per-view, at least not in the United States. Maybe you could do it in the UK. So there's issues there. But as a matchup, putting the business shit aside, yeah, why not, right?
Just moving forwards and on some fights on the horizon. Joshua Ngannou is ever close now. He's only a couple of weeks away from their fight. What's your take on it now, Dan? Obviously, we know what Ngannou can bring in a boxing sense because of what he produced against Tyson Fury. So there's a little bit more there for Anthony Joshua to work with.
Well, I just saw actually some clips on social media of Ngannou in his training camp, and he always is, I guess, in great shape. I'm not that familiar with his MMA background, but he certainly was in great shape when he fought Tyson Fury. He looks in even better shape to me going into this fight. Look, it's a good matchup. I mean, in terms of that kind of fight. I mean, yes, it's not Joshua in a heavyweight championship fight, but based on Ngannou's performance against Tyson Fury, and while Joshua was, I won't say waiting, but with the prospect of some other fight, maybe against Fury if he defeats Usyk. Obviously, the Wilder fight was supposed to be happening, but he lost, so that went away. And so the idea was, okay, Deontay lost in December. That messes up those plans. What's the next biggest fight we can make for, the next few months? And Ngannou was sitting there ready, willing to do it. The Saudis wanted the fight. So I think it's interesting. But I'll say this also. He's not sneaking up on anybody this time. When he fought Fury, I understand why Fury, I believe, took it lightly because he's like, I'm fighting a UFC guy. These guy's never been a boxer before. I'm the heavyweight champ of the world. I don't need to be, mentally anyway. I don't know if his heart was into it to really train the way you need to train at the top level. Anthony Joshua is not a dummy. He saw what happened there. He's like, oh shit, this guy's, he can really fight. I better make sure I'm 100% prepared. So I believe he'll be that way. And that will show when it comes fight night. But I'm interested. They just announced the pay-per-view price for that. Again, I don't love that it's $70 here in the United States. I didn't think it would happen, but when the Saudi folks did the pay-per-view in December that had Joshua and Deontay in the separate fights, remember that was originally supposed to be the Fury and Usyk date. They charged only $40 for that pay-per-view, and that was great value for the level of that show and all the good fights that were on it. But now we're back to the same old thing. They're back to the $70, still better than the $80 that they'll probably charge for some of the PBC fights and Canelo. So there's that aspect of it. But if you're a boxing fan, how are you not watching Joshua versus Ngannou?
One fight on that undercard was actually divided opinion on me. Again, interested to get your thoughts on his Zhang and Joseph Parker fight. It's a great matchup there. What's your take on it, Dan?
Yeah, that's a really good matchup. I mean, at the very least, I do tip the hat to the folks that are putting these big Saudi cards together. A lot of times we get a pay-per-view card for a lot of money where you got obviously a top-level main event and the undercard leaves something to be desired. Obviously, and I don't want to sit here and sound like I'm a promoter, but I can't tell you how many times I've been at press conferences or on calls and heard promoters parrot the line, oh, we got a card where this fight could be a main event on its own. Well, Zhang versus Parker could be a main event on its own. That's just the reality. It's a really good, interesting matchup. Look, Parker earned it by beating Wilder. Zhang is obviously in the position where he's one of the top heavyweights out there. He's got the WBO interim title. He's obviously in line to fight for the real title at some point, once Fury and Usyk and all that stuff plays out. And he showed how good he can be in terms of the way he handled against, handled his business against Joe Joyce. And so the question is, did he just have Joe Joyce's number and he's not as great as he looked, when he pummeled Joe in those two fights? And maybe Parker can bring a different look to him. He's a lot smaller, a little quicker, probably not as big of a puncher. And from Parker's point of view, it's like, hey, I beat Deontay Wilder, who was this fantastic puncher. And, I did the job on him and won pretty handily. Let's see if I can do it against another big, tall guy. But the difference is that Zhang is in a groove right now. He may not be the puncher that Wilder was, but at least he's been able to land his punches the way that Wilder was not able to do against Parker. So it's interesting. I mean, but it's going to be a big size differential, obviously. But Joe's used to it because when he fought against Wilder, he was, probably, I don't know, 4 inches shorter or something like that. So, like I said, good matchup for the undercard. I mean, whatever happens in the main event, this is a very solid heavyweight fight for that undercard. You're talking about Zhang and Parker, I would say, at this moment in time, 2 of the top 5 heavyweights in the sport. So as an undercard fight, I'm in.
Moving forward onto a now delayed date, Tyson Fury, Alexander Usyk, Dan. Has the cut to Tyson Fury changed your opinion at all as to how this fight could play out? Because obviously he's going to delay his preparations in terms of being able to spar. With that cut being the same way that Otto Wallin cut, if he was to open up again in the fight, you'd imagine Usyk might look to target it. It could create him problems. Has it changed your mind at all as to how May 18th now may play out?
I mean, I don't know if it's changed my mind because I really hadn't made up my mind in the first place, to tell you the truth. But I don't think there's any doubt that the cut is a factor because it was a bad cut. I mean, you don't have to be a fucking doctor to see how bad that cut was. And it's not a long time between when it happened and when he would actually have the fight. And there's going to be some sparring. They're going to have to take some obvious precautions in the sparring. And sparring is when you get ready. Sparring, I've heard for my entire career, the fights are won and lost in the gym. And if you can't be at your best in the gym to prepare, that does not necessarily bode so well on fight night. It doesn't necessarily mean he can't win the fight, obviously. But if you have to be that gingerly dealing with your sparring sessions as you prepare, it does give you pause. And it was, like I said, it's a bad cut. Now, he can probably do everything else he would do in a typical training camp, be at his absolute best in terms of all the things that go into it, whether it's, how he wants his weight to be, what his cardio is, working on this move, working on that move with the bag, with the mitts, you name it. But the sparring is the single most important thing in a training camp. And if you can't do that to the full level because you're so concerned that this fight could be in jeopardy if you suffer some other kind of injury on the eye, and, let's not forget the reason why it's such a big deal is because we're talking about tens and tens of millions of dollars that are at stake in the event. So, yeah, I mean, and I have no doubt that Usyk's going to go after that eye. Why wouldn't you? That's like the easiest target in the world. It's like low-hanging fruit. You go in there and I think, Alexander Usyk's first punch of the fight should be right on that eye if he can get it. And it's going to be up to Tyson Fury to be wary of that, to, make sure he keeps a high guard, be defensively responsible when it comes to the eye. And we'll see how it plays out. But the one thing that I always have in back of my mind when I see things like this is, we didn't know it at the time, but we knew it afterwards. You go back, I'll date myself a number of years. First fight between Oscar De La Hoya and Julio Cesar Chavez, fighting for Chavez. That was a huge mega fight with Chavez and Oscar. Chavez, had suffered a cut, a couple of weeks before the fight. They kind of kept it a little bit of a secret. The fight happened, cut opened up, and I think it was in the first or second round, and the fight was quickly over. Oscar was looking good, but it wasn't because he was doing huge damage to Chavez. It's just that the cut was bleeding so uncontrollably, they had no choice but to stop the fight. You'd hate to see the undisputed heavyweight championship fight get fucked up because of that situation of the cut opening in the second or first round or whatever, because they hadn't given it enough time to heal. That's the only bad thing I think about in the back of my mind, is what a ruin that would be. It would be shitty for Tyson. It would kind of cheat out Usyk of a quote unquote authoritative win if he can get it. It would cheat the fans who are going to spend a lot of time and money on the matchup. So I just hope the cut's okay and that we don't have any nonsense once the fight rolls around.
Just a final thing from me, Dan, is there's a certain young light heavyweight making his way over here, an Olympic silver medalist in Ben Whittaker, who's obviously been making some noise for the way that he boxes, his showmanship in the ring. I just wanted to get an understanding as to how that's been received in the US and what's been your thoughts from watching him entertain the crowd when he's been fighting.
I assume you don't want me at this point of this conversation to stand up and start doing the crazy moves that Ben does.
You can do if you want, Dan.
You'd lose a lot of your subscribers probably if I did that. I mean, look, Ben Whittaker, I follow him. I know him from the Olympics. I've watched his professional fights. I've seen the antics and the flashiness and all that. It's fun. I don't think, though, it may be all the rage in terms of the UK, either negatively or positively. And I know that some of those clips were sort of viral in terms of those crazy moves I just mentioned, in terms of on social media and everything. But honestly, I don't think most fans here, I've never had a single person in all the interactions I do on my social media platforms, on my newsletter. I don't know if I've ever had a single person even mention Ben Whittaker's name to me, much less voice an opinion about him one way or the other. I can kind of take it or leave it. I was a big Prince Nassim fan, so I get that. It doesn't turn me off. I think it's a little bit ridiculous when he hasn't really done anything as a professional. It's one thing to do all those kind of crazy moves when you're fighting a complete stiff. You can get away with that. Let's see what happens when he's fighting real guys. Now, that said, he's obviously got talent. Obviously, everybody thinks very highly of him. He had a great amateur career. And, I hope that he does develop into a star, because boxing needs stars and needs not only talented fighters, but people that move the needle. And when I say move the needle, positive or negative. Hamed was the kind of guy, and he made the point, I don't care if half you want to watch me because you love me and half you watch me because you hope I get knocked out. You're watching. Floyd Mayweather was the same way. I don't care if you love me or hate me, just watch. And because that generates interest, it generates money, and it generates conversation. And Ben Whittaker has the potential to be in that sort of same kind of way he'll conduct his career, where eventually, if he does reach the top level, there's going to be a lot of people that love Ben Whittaker for the antics and for the pizzazz and the glitz and the flashiness. And there's going to be a lot of other people that are more purists that are going to say, man, I hope that dude gets knocked out. But all of them are going to be watching. So let's continue to see how he develops.
Dan, it's a pleasure to catch up with you as always. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I will speak to you again soon. Thanks for speaking to me in Boxing News.
All right, Andy, appreciate that. Thank you, sir.